You're listening to the Kathie Owen podcast. I am your host, Kathie Owen, certified fitness trainer and life coach since 2002 and motivational speaker. Also, the founder of the Silver Wellness Academy at kathieowen.com. You can find links to the podcast and blog posts all at kathieowen.com, and that's KATHIEOWEN.com. Today we're going to talk about one of my absolutely favorite books. This is the beginning of a series of episodes I'm going to do on A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. And this book I read in 2006. Shortly thereafter, I started having my spiritual awakening. And if you've seen pictures of my book on my social media, you see it is worn, tattered, and highlighted with tons of little pages. I even took the course on Oprah Winfrey had on her show back in the old days, and Eckhart Tolle was on there, and this was in her book club. So I was teaching. I learned even more extensively about this book. This book contains so many seeds of elements of true life that can really profoundly change your life in a way that this is exactly what I teach, all right? So we're going to start with chapter 1, and that's what today is going to be about. And the chapter is called The Flowering of Human Consciousness. So think of human consciousness as the collective thoughts of the universe and collective thoughts of infinite intelligence. And so here we go. We're going to talk about the very beginning of the chapter. He starts with an invocation. Earth, 114 million years ago, one morning just after sunrise, the first flower ever to appear on the planet opens up to receive the rays of the sun. Prior to this momentous event that heralds an evolutionary transformation in the life of the plants, the planet had already been covered in vegetation for millions of years. The first flower probably did not survive for long, and flowers must have remained rare and isolated phenomena, since conditions were most likely not yet favorable for a widespread flowering to occur. One day, however, a critical threshold was reached, and suddenly there would have been an explosion of color and scent all over the planet if a perceiving consciousness had been there to witness it. It's like the same thing as if a tree falls in the forest. Does it make any sound? It's the same thing that he's talking about here. So he's talking about if the flower had nobody to perceive its beauty, did it really have beauty? He goes on to talk about, I like how he brings in the scripture from the Bible. He combines it with any other scripture or any other topic that covers spirituality. So it's more like Christianity and the Bible, to me, as I was raised, is more 3D consciousness. And that means you're living with your 5 senses. When you evolve out of 3D, you go to 4D, 5D, and 6D. And 6D is basically in higher consciousness and in touch with infinite intelligence. So keep an open mind, even as a Christian, because he does talk about all of that, and it awakened me to realize more about that. But he goes, here he says, humans would increasingly be drawn to and fascinated by them. He's talking about the flowers. As consciousness of human beings developed, flowers were most likely the first thing they came to value that had no utilitarian purpose for them. That is to say, was not linked in some way to survival. They provided inspiration to countless artists, poets, and mystics. Jesus tells us to contemplate the flowers and learn from them how to live. The Buddha is said to have given a silent sermon once, which he held up a flower and gazed at it. After a while, one of those present, a monk called, I can't pronounce his name, began to smile. He is said to have been the only one who understood the sermon. According to legend, that smile, that is to say, realization, was handed down by 28 successive masters and much later became the origin of Zen. He goes on to say later, flowers, more fleeting, more ethereal, and more delicate than the plants out of which they emerged, would become like messengers from another realm, like a bridge between the world of physical forms and the formless. We could look upon flowers as the enlightenment of plants. I like this paragraph and I put it in quotes, so here we go. That's pretty much what I'm going to do throughout this book, and I'll tell you when I'm reading and when I'm giving my input, if at all possible. Once there is a certain degree of presence, of still and alert attention in human beings' perception, they can sense the divine life essence, the one indwelling consciousness or spirit in every creature, every life form, recognize it as one with their own essence, and so love it as themselves. Until this happens, however, most humans see only the outer forms, unaware of the inner essence, just as they are unaware of their own essence and identity, only with their own physical and psychological form. He goes on to say, so when you are alert and contemplate a flower, crystal, or bird without naming it mentally, it becomes a window for you into the formless. So think about that for a moment. Think about or contemplate without naming it mentally. It becomes a window for you into the formless. A white bird, the dove, signifies the Holy Spirit in Christianity. So, next section in this book is called The Purpose of This Book. Can human beings lose the density of their conditioned mind structures and become like crystals or precious stones, so to speak, transparent to the light of consciousness? The messengers, Buddha, Jesus, and others, not all of them known, were humanity's early flowers. They were precursors, rare and precious beings. A widespread flowering was not yet possible at that time, and their message became largely misunderstood and often greatly distorted. It certainly did not transform human behavior, except in a small minority of people. He said that as you read this book, a shift takes place within you. That is very, very true. And it's true of any book like this. Like, I consider Reality Transurfing to be a book very similar to this in so many ways, but Eckhart Tolle is a lot easier to understand because English is his first language. So it's harder to understand Vadim Zeeland in reality transurfing because Russian is his first language. If we spoke Russian, we may understand it a whole lot better. He goes on to say, a glimpse is enough to initiate the awakening process, which is irreversible. This is so true because as you awaken from the consciousness level of 3D, you're living in your senses, you start to see things completely different, and you cannot reverse that once you start to see those things, which is a very good thing if you ask me, because I sure wouldn't want to go back to the 3D level that I was at prior to reading this book. He says, for some, that glimpse will come while reading this book. For many others who may not even have realized it, the process has already begun. This book will help them recognize it. For some, it may have begun through loss or suffering. For others, through coming into contact with a spiritual teacher or teaching. Through reading The Power of Now or some other spiritually alive and therefore transformational book, or any combination of the above. If the awakening process has begun in you, the reading of this book will accelerate it and intensify it. Yep, very, very true. All right, he goes on to say, an essential part of the awakening is the recognition of the unawakened in you. As I mentioned, when I recognize that 3D level, thinking through the five senses, I came to the realization that the questions who, what, where, when, why, and how became 3D thinking. And those questions are answered without words. They're answered through spiritual awakening, through 4D, 5D, 6D level of consciousness. And when you're thinking with the five senses, you're thinking through only what you can see, hear, touch, smell, and feel. He says, the first is unless you know the basic mechanics behind the workings of the ego, you won't recognize it, and it will trick you into identifying with it again and again. This means it takes you over, an imposter pretending to be you. The second reason is the act of recognition in itself is one of the ways in which awakening happens. When you recognize the unconsciousness in you, that which makes the recognition possible is the arising consciousness, is awakening. You cannot fight against the ego and win, just as you cannot fight against darkness. The light of consciousness is all that is necessary. You are the light. Next section, our inherited dysfunction. According to Christian teachings, the normal collective state of humanity is one of original sin. Sin is a word that has been greatly misunderstood and misinterpreted, literally translated from the ancient Greek in which the New Testament was written. To sin means to miss the mark, as an archer who misses the target. So to sin means to miss the point of human existence. To sin means to miss the point of human existence. It means to live unskillfully, blindly, and thus to suffer and cause suffering. I'm going to read that again. It means to live unskillfully, blindly, and thus to suffer and cause suffering. Again, the term, stripped of its cultural baggage and misinterpretations, points to the dysfunction inherited in the human condition. See, that's what I mean when I talk about toxic positivity. That is a sin right there. those two words together is a sin, because you're missing the mark, you're missing the point of consciousness, which means you're just going to continue to suffer. Let's go back to this a little bit more, because there's something I highlighted in here that I want to read about it. The achievements of humanity are impressive and desirable. We have created sublime works of music, literature, painting, architecture, and sculpture. Most recently, science and technology have brought about radical changes in the way we live and have enabled us to do and create things that would have been considered miraculously even 200 years ago. No doubt, the human mind is highly intelligent, yet its very intelligence is trained by madness. I'll read that again. Yet its very intelligence is trained by madness. Science and technology have magnified the destructive impact that the dysfunction of the human mind has upon the planet, other life forms, and upon humans themselves. That is why the history of the 20th century is where that dysfunction, that collective insanity, can be most clearly recognized. A further factor is that this dysfunction is actually intensifying and accelerating. Mind you, I'm skipping through this chapter and reading things that I had highlighted in the past. So there is so much more to this. He goes on to talk about wars and the Soviet Union and how human consciousness has evolved. But he goes on to say the collective manifestations of the insanity that lies in the heart of the human condition constitute the greatest part of human history. It is, to a large extent, a history of madness. If the history of humanity were the clinical case history of a single human being, the diagnosis would have to be chronic paranoid delusions, a pathological prosperity to commit murder and acts of extreme violence and cruelty against his perceived enemies, his own consciousness projected outward, criminally insane with few brief lucid intervals. Fear, greed, and the desire for power are the psychological motivating forces, not only behind warfare and violence between nations, tribes, religions, and ideologies, but also the cause of incessant conflict in personal relationships. They bring about a distortion in your perceptions of other people and yourself. Through them, you misinterpret every situation, leading to misguided action designed to rid you of fear and satisfy your need for more, a bottomless hole that can never be filled. So that paragraph right there that started fear, greed, and the desire for power are the psychological motivating forces. That right there describes the cycle downward spiral I was in with my ex-husband and the custody battle we were going through. And so I had read this book, and after I finished reading this book, I had this awakening that I was sitting in the parking lot and I was crying, and I was like, okay, what are the labels I've put on this? And look at the fear, greed, and desire for power that had gone on. When those are 3D things, those fear, greed, and power, and desire for power, those are 3-dimensional, and they're just products of the ego. I also highlighted this, and they talked about this in the class. You do not become good by trying to be good. but by finding the goodness that is already within you and allowing that goodness to emerge. But it can only emerge if something fundamental changes in your state of consciousness. Again, there we go. We're talking from 3D to 4D. And you're coming out of what you're finding that is, he calls it, we're trying to be good, but by finding the goodness that is already within you and allowing it to emerge. Next section, the arising new consciousness. Most ancient religions and spiritual traditions share the common insight that our normal state of mind is marred by a fundamental defect. He says, however, out of this insight into the nature of human conditions, we may call it the bad news, arises a second insight, the good news of the possibility of a radical transformation of human consciousness. I highlighted this. To recognize one's own insanity is, of course, the arising of sanity, the beginning of healing and transcendence. I like to think of this like you realize this crazy way I've been thinking is not, it's not solving the problem. It's just making it worse. It's like Einstein says, you cannot solve a problem with the same thinking that you've been thinking. That's the definition of insanity. He's talking about enlightened people like Buddha and Jesus. They spoke of sin, of suffering, of delusion. They said, look how you live. See what you are doing, the suffering you create. Teachings that pointed the way beyond the dysfunction of the human mind, the way out of the collective insanity, were distorted and became themselves part of the insanity. I like that how he says that, because we're so taught in certain spiritual, not even spiritual teachings, definitely not, but maybe through the Bible, when they look at it from a physical perspective, they look at it from a 3D perspective. There's a higher perspective to look at it. So I like how he says that in there. He goes on to say the truth to which they point still shines at their core. So what he's saying here is there's truth and elements in all spiritual teachings, and they all come into play. They all come together as one. Spirituality and religion is the next section in here. The more you make your thoughts, beliefs into your identity, the more cut off you are from the spiritual dimension within yourselves. Most religious people, and he puts religious in quotations, are stuck at that level. They equate truth with thought. And as they are completely identified with thought, their mind, they claim to be in sole possession of the truth in an unconscious attempt to protect their identity. They don't realize the limitations of thought. Unless you believe, in parentheses, think exactly as they do, you are wrong in their eyes. And in the not too distant past, they would have felt justified in killing you for that. And some still do, even now. Wow. So there's where I have trouble with religion, because they think if you do not think like I do, you're wrong. And that is so far from the truth. It's not even funny. And you don't even know. I don't even know the truth nobody really knows the truth. And like they say in the Kabbalion, all truths are half-truths. Don't ever say, I already knew that either. It just already comes into messing things up. How spiritual you are has nothing to do with what you believe, but everything to do with your state of consciousness. Wow, I like that. He says, how spiritual you are has nothing to do with what you believe, but everything to do with your state of consciousness. The urgency of transformation. A significant portion of the Earth's population will soon recognize, if they haven't already done so, that humanity is now faced with a stark choice: evolve or die. In his last section in here, I'll read this in its entirety. It's called A New Heaven and a New Earth. The inspiration for the title of this book came from a Bible prophecy that seems more applicable now than at any other time in human history. It occurs in both the Old and the New Testament and speaks of the collapse of the existing world order and the arise of a new heaven and a new earth. We need to understand here that heaven is not a location, but refers to the inner realm of consciousness. This is the esoteric meaning of the word. And this is also its measuring in the teachings of Jesus. Earth, on the other hand, is the outer manifestation in its form, which is always a reflection of the inner. Collective human consciousness and life on our planet are intrinsically connected. A new heaven is the emergence of transformed state of human consciousness, and a new earth is its reflection in the physical realm. Since human life and human consciousness are intrinsically one with the life of the planet, as the old consciousness dissolves, there are bound to be synchronistic, geographical, and climatic natural upheavals in many parts of the planet, some of which we are already witnessing now. Mind you, this book was written, I want to say it was written in 2004, 2005. I'll put it in the show notes because it's, of course, at the front of this book. But it's almost like calling what's going to happen. And I will go further to even say that, this is when the human consciousness started awakening. I mean, look at the pandemic that's happened, and that is exactly what he's talking about here. And in this book, you're going to see how suffering leads to awakening. Because eventually you're going to get so tired of suffering, so tired of your toxic positivity attitude, that eventually you're going to awaken and see that there is another way of looking at this. And that's what this chapter talks about. And I love it. And I can't tell you enough how much this book has changed my life. And I hope to share it with you and hope to help you see things in a different light as well, as we go through this journey together and read this book. And I'm thinking of even reading Power versus Force by Dr. David Hawkins, because that is another book that really will help you see that there are so many different levels of consciousness and how to raise your vibrations so you are at that upper level and get to where you don't see suffering the way the 3D world sees it. All right, that's my podcast for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, I'll see you next time. Peace out and namaste.